Hi there. Today we're going to have a look at how I painted this in Rebelle 5. Okay, so we're just about to start painting. Let's have a quick look at what we've got set up before we start. So the canvas size we've got is A4 at 200 dpi in portrait mode, and at the moment we've got 3 layers, two that have been filled in with a basic background colour, and then an image that I've brought in, which was my original underpainting work that I did. So we can have a look at those layers. So that was the quick sketch work that I did as part of the preparatory material, and once we start painting, then I'll use that as some of the colour source, and we'll do a little bit of colour sampling from that underlying image. And then we've got 2 layers, so I'll be painting on the top layer. The reason we've got the background underneath is if I use the eraser, then I don't want to erase it back to canvas colour, I want to erase it to the same colour, so that's what the background layer underneath will do. In terms of the visual settings, we're using the Pro version. So we've got the nanopixel technology enabled, which will allow us to zoom in and get quite a lot of extra detail without having to work at very high pixel resolution. And we've also got the granulation, which we'll use when we do some of the watercolour layers, to be able to do the kind of watercolour glazing to darken parts of the image. And a key part of that is the re-wet, making sure that that's set to 0 so that we get a kind of glazing effect, which we'll use at that point. We've got 2 reference pictures loaded in. One's the original photograph that I took a couple of years back when I was on holiday. I just really liked the shape of this tree and the basic kind of composition. Preparation work, we did some digital work, we simplified it, and did a little bit of colour adjustments, but generally the overall composition was roughly what I was looking for. And then I did a preparatory sketch using a program called ArtSet on the iPad, which gives me just a general sense of the kind of shapes and colours and the balance between the drawing and painting and the sort of random marks, and just gives me a sense of the overall sort of image that I'm aiming for. So those are images that I'll be referring to, and then I've also got other material, other assets that I'll bring in as we start. In terms of brushes, again, same as the last painting I did, I'm largely only going to use these 6 brushes. 2 of them are brushes that I've made myself, and these are brushes that have interesting textures and interesting grains. So it's a standard shape, but then I've imported my own grain that has random shapes and bits of text within it, which is one of the sort of features of the kind of style that I've got. So I make those sorts of brushes. So I've got 2 of those, and then the other 4 are just copies of standard Rebelle 5 brushes that I've just put all into this one palette. So copied them and then just moved them across so that I've got all my brushes together in one place. And the idea is I'll just use a mixture of these as we go through. So to start the painting, what I want to do is get effectively a first pass, very big, bold, loose brush marks, and at this sort of stage, really looking for just general colours, starting to mix colours. Not going to be bound by either the reference photo or the preparatory work that I did. I'm really just going to use a combination of these, use the colour picker, use some of the colours from these, and just start to find different colours as we go along. So at this stage, the way I usually talk about it is I'm thinking of this as much a sort of colour mixing palette as it is using the specific colours from either of these images, and we're not trying to draw the painting yet. I'm not trying to paint things that are there. I'm just starting to explore interesting colours and see what starts to build up. So we can go over to the reference photo or the reference picture, and we can pick some of those colours and start to use those. And similarly, we can do that from the initial sketch work that I had done. So we use different brushes. You can see I've got the quick volume settings so that we can quickly change the brush size and scale, which is a very quick way to do it. I find that panel very useful. The other thing you'll notice at this point is similar to the last painting, I'm not going to go particularly dark with the colours at the moment. We'll do that later in the painting as we start to do the dark washes and bring out the dark areas using the sort of glazing techniques. So at the moment I'm more interested in sort of building out the lighter colours and just getting the general sense of the colours that I want to try and use as I go forward. So you'll see as I carry on painting at the moment, there is a little bit of drawing going on, just looking at some of the bigger shapes and just doing a very, very loose nod to a block-in. I wouldn't even call it a block-in at this stage. But as I say, the priority is really more about looking at colours and blending things together and finding an overall colour palette for the image rather than actually trying to paint and render the reference image and the shapes and things. That sort of definition will come later. This is just really at this stage much more about getting the colours and getting the colour palette for the whole picture established. So the other thing that we're trying to look at the moment is really just to build up a little bit of surface texture. Obviously the canvas that we're using has a certain texture and depth to it, but the brushes that I'm using here also have a thickness and a kind of impasto to what they're putting down. So part of this stage is just to make an interesting surface so that it's not just the bare canvas texture. It's actually really got interest and it will give something for the washes. When I come to do the sort of dark washes, it will give the watercolor wash simulation something to work against. So it's not just picking up the canvas texture; it'll actually flow around these marks and lines and interact with it, which helps to give a lot more randomness and a lot more interest to the way that the wash ultimately goes down. So at this point, we've pretty much got the whole sort of canvas covered as a kind of first layer, and what I'm going to do is now just bring in a few more colours from my original sketch without trying to do too much in terms of the sort of dark colours, because we'll come to those, but just to bring through a little bit more of that and sort of mix it in and blend it in. So the way we'll do that is we'll just select that layer and do it as a tracing layer for just now, and you can see with the dots that means that that's now going to affect the painting layer, and we need to select our painting layer to go back to paint on that. And we'll use paint and blend so we can kind of bring the colour through and then just mix them in a little bit. So again, I'm thinking of this as much around just trying to find more interesting colours rather than trying to clone this, shape-wise, or start to try and do the sort of finished painting. Okay, so I've got enough there in terms of the basic sort of underlying colours that we can now use for the image. So what I've done is brought in the first very rough sketch, so one of the sort of prepared assets that I did as part of the preparatory work. You'll see that it is very, very loose as a sketch, and it's just a handful of lines to help place some of the big shapes. And what we're going to do is bring that in, so that's the layer at the top. I'm going to switch off the tracing because we don't need that anymore, and I'm going to stay on the lines layer just now. I'm going to set the transparency to lock, so that any painting that we're doing will only affect the lines and not paint anywhere else. And then what I'm going to do is just use some of the colours from the image and just basically paint in the line work. And the reason for doing this is most of these lines will probably end up being covered over and painted over in the final image. But if any of them do remain, then what I want to make sure is that they're not just black lines that really don't sort of sit very well with the rest of the image. And just by doing this, it helps to bring them in and sort of unify them as part of the image. So if any of these lines do remain, then they'll sit nicely within the final image. So I'm just picking colours from the painting just to do this, and you'll see that I'm doing some dark lines on the light areas and some lighter lines on the darker areas. Just so we've got a contrast. At the end of the day, all I need is enough contrast in the line to be able to see what it is to then paint in. So we don't need a huge amount of detail in this. And that will probably do for just now. So you can see that compared to the original black lines, the black lines stood out very distinctly as a separate layer, whereas these lines now feel a little bit more integrated with the image. So when we drop that layer down and now make that all part of the painting layer, that's going to work more effectively, and those colours will blend in as we start to paint. So now I'm going to largely use the colours from the image itself. This is now the palette. We've got lots of really nice greens. We've picked up a little bit of purples and browns. We've got some really nice blues and some nice blue, grey neutrals. Lots of interesting colours there to work with in the image. So this is now my colour palette going forward. And what we'll do is just start to block in now to these sorts of shapes. But in doing that, because we've got all this kind of randomness behind it, the block-in is going to blend in a little bit and keep some of those underlying colours. So we can use that kind of initial randomness to help us add a bit more interest to the image. What I won't do is block in the darker areas. We'll come back and do those with watercolour washes at a slightly later stage. The other thing is you'll see that I'm still working on this pretty well zoomed out at the moment. I'm not going to start zooming in. I'm not going to start trying to draw details. We'll work on the image kind of as a whole at this sort of scale for quite a while before we get anywhere ready to start to zoom in and paint any kind of details within it. So at this point, you'll see I'm just going back in and really just adding a bit of general randomness to the image. One of the things I'm always trying to be really careful of is that I don't start to get into lots of detail and illustration too early, which is always really tempting that you start to get in and start defining lots of edges, lots of detail, lots of fine marks. So doing sort of quick exercises like this that effectively, in some ways, mess up the painting, actually just helps keep it fresh and loose and keeps the process of working on top of things rather than trying to refine and illustrate every last detail. So you'll see this as a process I go through a number of times, just making marks by hand or adding in random shapes and then painting over them, which all look like they're adding randomness and mess into the image. But that's a very deliberate step to help with the general overall process and to try and make an overall looser image that is as much about responding to the image and creating something that's ultimately new and is a thing in its own right, not just some sort of academic exercise in terms of copying the reference, copying the image, copying the sketch, and just getting into a very kind of mechanical, kind of illustrative mode. So I find these sorts of things helpful to refresh the looseness of the image as you if you start to tighten up too early, then it could be a good way to just loosen up and get back to making marks and being a bit more expressive. So one of the things I was just looking at there is it's an interesting little bit of sort of purple lilac coming through just at the sort of fringes of the cloud, and it's echoed a little bit in just some touches of some of the moors and hills. There's a little bit of kind of sort of distant heather sort of colouring there, which I've tried to lift. So I think that's a nice colour theme for this image. So I've tried to take that through and bring that through into some of the areas that will be a bit darker, just so we get a little bit of colour coherence and colour consistency across the whole colour palette. And that's one of the things that I'll look for, is to try and unify the colours, because in the original reference photo, it is very distinct areas that we have the very light, bright blue sky at the top, and photographically you get real sort of distinction between those. It's not sort of unified or harmonized. So you can see in the original sketch work there was looking at ways to bring the sort of blue down into the greens and find blue greys, and that was part of that thinking process, is how do we unify the colours across the whole image, and not just do local colours, which is what you tend to get from a sort of photographic perspective. So now what I'm going to do is first of all make a copy of the layer that was from the first session. So we'll keep that in case we want to go back to anything. It always allows us to undo stuff. And what I'm going to do is to start this next session just introducing some more randomness, different shapes, different marks, and various things. So to do that, I'm going to import some assets that I've made previously. So these are various shapes, marks, textures, and bits of text. And generally what we'll do with these is bring them in, move them around until I'm happy with where the item is. We'll accept that, and then we'll lock the transparency for that particular asset that we've just brought in, and then we can paint into that to unify the colours. So once I'm happy with that, then we'll just commit that down. So we'll take the transparency off and just merge that down so that we continue to generally work on one layer. And that way we can constantly kind of blend and mix things together. So that was one. So let's just do the same thing again. We'll bring in different asset. So this is a set of pre-made brush strokes. So these were originally done traditionally, sort of on paper and then scanned in. So they're sort of based on real marks made on real paper. And what we want to do is just to use the shapes of those marks to give us a little bit more randomness. So same principle, we'll bring that in as a new layer. We'll lock the transparency and then we'll paint into these shapes to integrate them in terms of colour. What you'll also notice is that it's helping to give thick texture shapes because it's constraining the brush strokes and allowing the thickness and texture of the brush to flow into the mark that was made previously. So what we end up with is something that looks like a really kind of thick individual mark, which helps to stand out and provide a little bit of visual interest in terms of what we're trying to do. So again, once we're happy with the general colour integration, we can finish that off and then just drop that down. Again, a lot of these marks will get covered up as we sort of paint subsequent layers, but this just helps to keep us thinking about loose marks and gestures and shapes, and just helps to avoid getting into too much detail too early. So generally happy with that, so we will drop that layer down. And then we'll bring something else in. So let's have a look at what we can do this time. Do some random line marks down. Again, same principle, we'll bring that in, we'll lock the transparency, and then we'll just integrate it with the colours that are in the image. That'll do for that one. So same thing, we'll just drop that down so we're back to a single layer again. And I think that will do us for just now, and we can get back to just doing a little bit more freehand painting. So now what we want to try and do is to work a little bit more on the contrast. So at the start I said I was going to keep the dark areas much lighter than they would ultimately end up, and then we would use some washes and glazes to be able to add that dark wash. So that's what we're going to do now. So what I've prepared is another sort of preliminary asset that I created, which is a very loose mask. So this was created, you can see it's not sort of photorealistic, it's not sharp edged, and the way that this was created was using a sort of auto painting software and some manual hand painting and a combination of things, so that what we end up with is something that looks like a painted mask rather than a digitally extracted mask. So what we're going to do is to first of all we bring that layer in, and on the layer menu on the filter menu, we're going to convert black to alpha. So that's the areas of the picture that we want to start to add some darker areas into. And then what we need to do is to apply that mask to the image. So this layer becomes the mask. So we've got the black and white mask layer. We make that a mask, and we want to mask the opaque areas. So the white areas effectively become masked and can't be painted on, and the transparent areas are where the watercolour is going to go. So that's now a mask, and it's going to apply to any layer with a dot against it. So we can come down to our layer to paint on, and to make that a little bit easier to paint on, what we'll do is just make the mask invisible. So it's still applying the mask, it's not going to get in the way of what we're doing. And we're going to use some watercolour techniques for this. So we use the standard watercolour brushes, and as we said earlier, one of the most important things with this is the re-wet. What we don't want is re-wet of anything other than 0, otherwise you'll see the paint, and particularly the thick paint that you've got, will just re-wet and then flow, which is not what we want to do. We want the glaze to flow over these marks. The other thing I'll do here is I'll put the diffusion speed up a little bit so that it's diffusing quite quickly, and we'll look at the colour that we want to use initially, which will be reasonably dark, and then we'll just give that a test, see how that's going to behave, and you can see that that's going to flow. It will flow into the canvas, and where there's paint and thicker marks, that's going to flow around it. So just a little bit more water into that, make that a little bit bluer, a little bit greener. If we just zoom in a bit, then we can have a look at this interacting a bit more closely with the texture. And what I'll do is I'll just add a little bit more tilt so that the water will flow slightly, and then hopefully we'll see how that starts to react both with the underlying canvas texture and also the marks and the thickness of the paint that was there originally. So once we've let that dry, and that gives us an overall stronger contrast in the image. So we've now started to bring out much more of the lights and the darks, but we've been able to do that in a way where the dark colours are a bit thinner, and they've been able to interact with all these sort of marks and shapes, and helps to create a bit of randomness, a bit of interest, and give us new things that we can start to work with. And as I said, one of the things we need to be really careful with using masks is that the more detailed the mask, the more that it sits in contrast with the thicker, looser painting style. So we need to be really careful that we don't end up with a mask that's got lots of really sharp, crisp edges. And what we're going to do now as we continue to paint is actually make sure that these areas integrate, so that we handle the edges and the transitions, so that we don't end up with two distinct areas of the painting that aren't really sitting together. So for the moment we can take the mask off again, and then that allows us to go back to freehand painting, just going back to the original oil brushes that we were using. Okay, so as we start session 3, I want to bring back a bit more randomness again. Before I do that, what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer, and I'm also going to duplicate the original layer, and then I am going to merge those together so that we get a little bit extra texture coming through. So you can see with the second layer, there's a reasonable amount of texture there, but there was actually some of the original texture that was lost as we started to paint into that. So by merging those two together, then we can bring a little bit of that back, and that just helps to improve the surface texture. So to add a bit of randomness, we'll just bring in some more shapes, quite similar to what we had earlier, and we'll just position those. Okay, and so I'm happy with that. And then the same thing again, we'll lock the transparency on that layer, and then we'll just paint into them to integrate them into the painting. Okay, so once we're happy with that, we'll take the transparency off and drop that layer down. And then bring some more random lines in. And same thing again, lock the transparency, and then just integrate them with the colours from the painting. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is just work a wee bit more on the shadow shapes and the shadow details. And again, we'll use a mask to be able to do that. So again, this is pre-prepared. And what you'll notice with this one compared to the first one is there's slightly more detail in this. It's still not photographic. It's not got sharp edges and a huge amount of detail, but there's definitely more. There's a little bit of texture, there's a little bit of shapes, and a few things that I want to try and bring out with this. So we'll do the same thing again. We'll bring the layer in. We will go to filter. We'll do black to alpha, so the black disappears and we can see the painting. That's where we want to add some more dark information. And we will set that layer to be the mask, and we want to mask the opaque, and we'll then hide it so that we're able to go to the layer and start painting on that. So we use the watercolor tools, and we're not going to paint every single bit of the mask. What I want to do is just to bring through some of the details of it and find a few bits that we can add some extra information without getting hopefully too fussy with some of the information that comes through. What I do want to do is bring through a little bit of the branch structure. We'll do some more drawing once we bring in the more detailed sketch, but for just now I want to try and get a little bit more information in that sort of space. So once we've let that diffuse and then dry, we can switch the mask off and go back to the layer to then just start painting back into some of that. Again, we'll be using the paint and blend, so we can start to pick up on some of those colours that have just gone down and use that to influence the colours that we're painting with. So the next thing we want to do is to start finally to think about a little bit more in terms of detail. So what we're going to do is bring in the slightly more refined sketch that we did, and you'll see there's a bit more detail, a bit more lines, but again it's still not hugely detailed, but it just gives us enough to think about a little bit more in terms of shapes and edges. So again, same principle that we've done many times before. Bring the layer in, we will lock the transparency, and then first thing we'll do is to paint some colours into the line work so that we integrate the black lines and have something that we can work with, give us enough to be able to see what we're doing, but without having this separate kind of black line layer that would otherwise sit very differently from the rest of the picture. So once we're happy with that, we've got the line work carrying some of the colours of the painting, then again we will drop that down onto the layer, just merge that down, and now probably for the first time we'll really start to zoom in and start the next level of detailed work. So for this session, what I want to look at is the main areas of the picture that I want to try and correct. We're generally getting an overall sense of the image, but there's a couple of areas looking at it that I really want to try and bring out and strengthen, particularly when I look back to the initial sketch. So I think these trees in the distance read more clearly as a shape in the original sketch. So even though we've got some interesting marks and textures down here, what I really want to do is just focus a bit more on some of the bigger shapes and bring those back. Look a little bit at some of the edge work along the sort of hill line there, and also the overall tree shape. So in the original sketch, the tree shape read more clearly than what we have at the moment. So I want to get a bit more contrast between the tree and the sky. So that will be darkening the tree slightly and lightening the sky, just to help bring out some more of that contrast. So I'm not going to use the masks, but I will do some glazing, particularly down in the trees, and I'll just do that effectively freehand and then paint back into that. So one of the things I was just having a look at there was using the fan brush to bring in a little bit more texture into some of these. And what I noticed was with the settings, the fan brush was set to an angle of 180. So basically that brush is moving with the angle of the pen. But what I wanted was the orientation to be the other way up. So that's a slightly awkward angle to hold my hand at. So if we take the angle down to 0, then what we get is the brush rotated around 180 degrees. So we get the mark in a different orientation, which is more comfortable to use. So that's what I'm going to do for just now. So at this point, I've got the general sort of structure of the painting in place. I've resolved the issues that I was trying to work on in terms of bringing out the shapes, getting better contrast in terms of the tree, doing a little bit more detailed work in terms of the shapes of the trunk, and just generally getting a bit more of the sense of the contrast that I had in the original sketch, without losing too much of the texture and detail. So at this point, what I'm going to do is really start to move into the sort of finishing touches and to bring back some of the character and feel and looseness that we had. So the big marks, the lines, the text, and things that we had added at various stages, and a lot of those have got painted over and incorporated back in. So what I want to do is just bring out some more of those. So now that I've added in those extra layers with marks that include shapes, some random lines and text, that helps to break up the image and the surface again, and just give more interest in terms of the marks and the details. So I think I'm getting quite close to what I'm trying to do with this. And typically what I'll do now is just take a bit of a break, look at the image, and just look at any sort of final areas that I want to clarify or change or correct. But to try and keep the final set of changes to more specific things that I really want to look at and try and deal with. So now that I've had a chance to look at the painting and just reflect on where it's got to, there's a few final things that I want to work on and correct. So some of the marks that I added up around the tree have distracted a little bit from the shape and silhouette of the tree. So I'm going to either move those or repaint them or remove them completely and just redefine the overall shape of the tree a little bit more clearly so we're not losing that. The other things I want to look at are maybe just darkening the bushes down in the foreground just to bring those up a little bit. Bring a little bit more detail into the tree. The sense of the trunk has been lost a little bit with some of those marks. And then possibly this area where we've got the sort of solid mark has lost that shape a little bit, so I might paint back into that. And then generally just a few little touch-ups. So at the moment, I've got a lot of these marks on individual layers, so that means I can do various things in terms of cutting them out and moving them around or deleting them. Once I've done that, then I'll flatten all of those down so that I can do some washes and some painting on that final single layer. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. And so this is what we end up with. I've printed it out, and as you can see, an A4 image at 200 dpi. When we use the Rebelle 5 nanopixel technology, allows us to export it quite easily at larger sizes. This is an A2 print, and it looks really good. I'm really impressed with what Rebelle's been able to do. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that was interesting. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And if you'd like to see more from myself, my name is Pete Smith, and look for Basement Picasso. Thank you.